We'll mention later when we look at the definition of service management, we'll talk about organisational capabilities. So probably worth just flagging here, what do we mean by capability? So capability, it's the ability of the organisation, a person, a process, an application, a piece of technology, a configuration item to carry out a particular activity. Okay, so it's the ability to deliver and perform an activity. And we'll look at that later when we look at service management. Understanding value. What we've seen in the service definition, the whole purpose of a service is that it creates some form of value. If it doesn't create value, why are we using it? And value ripples through all of ITIL 4, virtually every page of every publication, every diagram, almost every definition, to be fair, has some reference to value. So we need to understand what we mean by value. The definition is value is the perceived benefits, usefulness and importance of something. Okay, so to create value, it must be of some use, it must be of some benefit. Again, otherwise, why would we use it? The word perception is quite important, or perceived benefits, yeah? So that suggests that one person might see value in something, another person might not. And so to understand value, there's a couple of things we need to understand in terms of the nature of value. So it can be subjective, okay? It can be influenced, yeah, negatively or positively. Yeah, stakeholders and their perceptions can vary. One of the important characteristics of value is to understand that it is defined by the consumer or the customer. In other words, an IT service provider can tell its customer, its sponsor, its users that they're getting fantastic service and they're really lucky to have, them as an IT service provider. But ultimately, the decision on value will come from the sponsor or the users or the customer. I can tell you that this course, is going to be a fantastic value to you and that you're going to have a great learning experience, and this time and effort you put in, you're going to get fantastic value from this course, and you're going to get fantastic value from me as your instructor. Well, I can tell you that, but you will decide later, whether you feel actually this course was of value and whether the instructor has helped you be successful in, gaining your certificate in foundation level for IT service management. So that's a really, really important sort of characteristic of value. It's not the provider, it's not the giver, it's the receiver, it's the recipient, it's the beneficiary, and that's quite important. Another important characteristic is that what people value, what the consumer organisation might value, can change over time and circumstance. Yeah, so what we valued 2 years ago, we might not necessarily value as much today. So that's quite important. When we look later in the course at guiding principles, there is in fact a guiding principle called focus on value. And these two sort of characteristics are really important. Understand value is defined by the customer, and understand that what customers value can change over time and circumstance. So we need to understand that if we are to continue to deliver value, we need to recognise when customers actually maybe change what they perceive as value from their IT services and the IT organisation. And the last bit really is this perceived, value. It's subjective, it's perceived value, and it can be influenced positively or negatively, by how well expectations from the customer are met. And ultimately, the last thing around value, and we will touch on this later in the course, is value consists of sort of three things really, going back to our VOCR. Value from an IT service is that it helps support, create the outcomes, those results that are important for the consumer. Because if it doesn't do that, why would they use it? Why would they pay for it? And of course, value has to be affordable. There's no point spending a lot of money on things that you don't really make use of. There's no point spending a lot of money on things where maybe you don't get the results that you expect. So value has to be affordable, and it has to be at a level of risk which is acceptable to you as a consumer organisation. Okay, so those three sort of elements: outcome, affordable, acceptable risk. So whilst we're looking at value, let's look at this term value co-creation. You'll recall in the service definition, it said a service is to enable value co-creation. So what do we mean by this? Well, value co-creation is where both parties, provider and consumer, work more closely together. Yeah, they better understand each other. So the provider better understands what the consumer organisation is trying to achieve, what those outcomes are for them to be successful, and how can IT create and add maybe additional value to the consumer in being successful. The consumer needs to also understand more about the provider and its capabilities and what else they can bring to the service. So this is very much a more collaborative model than perhaps we've seen in the past, where typically the service provider-consumer relationship was pretty much based around, we provide these services, you use those services, and we'll have an SLA, and providing things sort of work and we meet all our SLA targets, that's basically it. In ITIL 4, no, we want a more collaborative model, because if value is really important to both sides, value being delivered from the provider, value being gained from the consumer, then it's important both parties regularly work together to see what opportunities might exist to create better value. And this is where we introduce this sort of concept of service relationship between provider and service consumer. I'm going to give you an example from my time in financial services. To be fair, at the time, I probably didn't recognise it as value co-creation, but it is a really good example of what we mean by actually the consumer and the provider working together, better understanding each other to actually create additional value, to create that value co-creation. And the example I'm going to give is around ATMs, cash machines. And there was a situation some years ago where in a sort of consumer survey, the bank that I work for came bottom of the league table in terms of what consumers felt about the quality of the ATMs and the ATM service delivered to that bank's customers. And not surprisingly, questions were going to be asked of the part of the business that was responsible for ATMs. So within the business, within the consumer organisation of the retail bank, was a department that was responsible for ATM operations. Which ATMs do we use? Where do we locate ATMs? Making sure ATMs get fixed if they physically break. Making sure ATMs get topped up with cash so that when customers want cash, the ATM has sufficient funds to be able to dispense cash to customers. Okay, and so as I said, not unreasonably, questions were being asked by the senior executives of the bank as to why this bank was bottom of the league table. So inevitably there was a metaphoric knock on the door of IT by the ATM business to have a discussion about, so what can IT do to improve the overall availability of the ATM network and the availability of the ATMs to deliver cash to customers. Now, being IT, we looked at our current sort of service level agreements, we looked at the trend of service performance, and to be fair, over the last several months, service has been excellent. We've met every SLA target consistently every month. And therefore, actually, there's not an awful lot we can do over and above what we're doing. We might have tried to sort of give a little bit of an indication of sort of things that were perhaps coming through the pipeline in terms of software upgrades and technology, hardware upgrades, which might have some benefit in terms of availability. But that was a little bit of what we might call jam tomorrow. In terms of the current situation, we were pretty much delivering everything that you wanted and more. So there's nothing we could do. Sensing that that probably wasn't what they wanted to hear, we started to talk a little bit more about the ATM service. Because the IT view of the ATM service was networks, network infrastructure, front-end processors, back-end processors, load balancers, database systems, online transaction systems, monitors, batch schedulers, That was our view of the ATM service. And in the conversation around, well, why have customers rated the bank so low? We started to understand a little bit more about the customer experience of using an ATM. And what we found out in the conversation was that every time a customer is declined, there is a status code that the application basically writes. So not surprisingly, one of the biggest reasons customers get declined is they have no money, insufficient funds. So there might be a status code A recorded for that transaction as to why it was declined. Sometimes people forget their PIN, or sometimes they forget the PIN and try again. And so there were status codes for, incorrect PIN or an incorrect second attempt of a PIN. So this concept of status codes, which we didn't really know, this was in an application package, we didn't really understand the instrumentation within that package, but the business did. And what we found were some status codes that were related to customers being declined due to an IT condition. Not the system's down, but things like the database is being updated, and at that point in time, you can't access your balance, and so you get declined because the database has got a lock. This might be during the evening processing when accounts are being updated. It could be that your transaction has been declined because it's timed out. So maybe, there's some performance issues which are causing transactions to be declined based on a timer. There were some status codes which were related to perhaps customer information, customer data not being available during, say, backup processing overnight. So there was these sort of what I'd call under the bonnet IT conditions that actually resulted in customers being declined. And we didn't know anything about that. So with that information, we were able to look at how we sort of do things, how we scheduled our sort of overnight processing, understand perhaps we needed to be more focused on performance around the ATM service. And we could then initiate a number of improvement initiatives based on those status codes and then measure over time how many customers have actually been, if you like, reduced in terms of being declined due to these error conditions. Equally, in talking to the business, one of the challenges they had was, of course, making sure that the ATMs were, effectively replenished with money. So an ATM can be up and available, but it's no use to the customer if it doesn't have cash. What they didn't know that we knew was that each ATM could have a threshold set, on the network, so that when a particular ATM gets to, let's say, 50% empty in terms of its cash, it can generate an alert. We could capture that alert, and initially we would provide a sort of hourly report to the business to say these are the ATMs that are now starting to run low on cash, and they could proactively use that to direct the teams that would go out and replenish the ATMs. They could do it on a more sort of scientific basis rather than before, sort of which are the busiest ATMs, which are the locations that get a lot of usage. We could actually be proactive, and then over time we could move away from a report to actually an online alert-based system. So we could generate an alert real time to the ATM operations function in the business to say this ATM has now hit a threshold on 50% sort of empty, 25% empty. You need to direct someone to go and actually replenish the ATM. So this is a good example of what we mean by value co-creation. Okay, because basically, without that conversation, we didn't really understand the ATM service. We didn't really understand it from a customer perspective. Our view of the ATM service was the technology. our view of whether the ATM service is successful was, did we meet our SLA? We had no real concept of customers getting cash, customers not getting cash. And we certainly didn't know about customers being declined due to, as I say, some under the bonnet IT conditions. So these were things that wouldn't affect an SLA, but they would affect a customer. Equally, the business had issues that when they talked to us, we could actually help them. So this replenishment was a really good example of, we can provide them with real-time alerts for every ATM when it hits a certain threshold. So be proactive, top up the ATMs that are running out of money. So the point of this example is, those things would not have happened without the consumer and the provider looking at the ATM service and looking for opportunities where we could collectively work together, collaborate, and actually improve the overall quality of the service, creating more value ultimately for the customers of the bank and their usage of ATMs. So that's a really good example of what we mean by value co-creation. So earlier we talked about ITIL being best practice for service management. So what is service management? Well, I'll start with the basic description really, which is, you are IT practitioners and you work for an IT service provider organisation. And the IT service provider organisation delivers IT services to its consumers. Those services need to be managed. And in essence, that's service management, managing our IT services. So they deliver what's expected in terms of service quality consistently. In terms of a specific definition of what is service management, then it's defined in ITIL as a set of specialised organisational capabilities for enabling value for customers in the form of services. So we mentioned earlier, we sensitised you to the term capability, the ability to perform an activity well and perform an activity consistently. But what do we mean by organisational capabilities? Well, to do something well, we're probably going to rely on people. So we want people, but we want people with the skills that's necessary to deliver and manage those IT services. We want people with knowledge and insight, of how the technology supports the services that we deliver to our consumers. One of the unique selling points for any IT organisation is, of course, its people and the insight and knowledge they have of how their technology supports their consumers. Nobody else has that, only you have that. Okay, so that's a really important part of the capability. Okay, you're never going to win a game of football or any sporting competition unless you have players with skills, knowledge and insight. Of course, in terms of organisational capabilities, the work that we do, the activities that we have to perform day in, day out. So we need to have good processes. This is the way we do things around here. And those processes underpinned by tools that allow us to do things in an efficient and effective way. If you think of the service desk, there's no point having an incident management process if you don't have a tool that allows you to log and record and manage incidents. And of course, part of our capability as a service provider will be through the technologies we use to deliver our services. And then finally, what I probably call ways of working. It's the culture. It's the way we do things. So having fantastic people with lots of IT qualifications, having world-class processes, the leading edge tools and technologies is one thing. But if you don't have a culture which is always interested in asking the question, can we do things better? Can we improve? Then your organisational capability won't mature. It won't improve. In fact, you may go backwards. So we also need to have this culture, this service culture of always looking, can we do things better that delivers better value for our consumers? And that's really what we mean by organisational capabilities. It's the capabilities of the organisation, its people, the processes and tools and technologies that it uses, and the culture of the organisation to always challenge itself. Can we do something better to create better value for our consumers. That's what we mean by the organisational capability. Okay, so just a reminder, what is service management? A set of specialised organisational capabilities for enabling value for customers in the form of services. And you, as IT practitioners, are part of that organisational capability.